In a world where time never stops, how many moments have slipped through your fingers simply because you hesitated? How many opportunities have passed you by while you stood frozen in your own thoughts, trapped in a cycle of endless what-ifs? It happens so often that we barely notice it, until it's too late. Ethan was one of those people. He was smart, capable, and had big aspirations. Yet, he was caught in a silent battle within his own mind. Every decision, big or small, felt like a crossroads with infinite possibilities, each leading to a different outcome. The weight of making the right choice was unbearable. Even something as simple as sending an email or speaking up in a meeting felt like an insurmountable task. He would play out every possible scenario, analyzing every risk, trying to predict the reactions of others. His mind was constantly buzzing, working overtime. But in the end, he rarely moved forward. His life remained still while the world around him raced ahead. The people around him noticed. His friends would say, "Ethan, just make a decision and move on." His colleagues at work encouraged him. "Stop overthinking. Just do it." But it wasn't that simple. He wanted to act. He wanted to move forward. But his mind wouldn't let him. It was as if he was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he needed to jump but unable to take the leap. Then came the moment that could have changed everything. His company announced a leadership program. A golden opportunity that could propel his career forward. Only a select few would be chosen. And Ethan met all the qualifications. But there was a catch. He had only 24 hours to apply. Time was slipping away. And deep inside, he knew he wanted this. He had dreamed of stepping into a leadership role for years. Of proving his worth and taking on bigger challenges. Yet, when he sat down to write his application, he hesitated. What if my application isn't strong enough? What if I embarrass myself in front of my peers? What if they think I'm not good enough? What if I get rejected? The questions circled endlessly in his mind, creating an invisible wall between him and his future. The more he thought, the more paralyzed he became. He told himself he would start after dinner, then after one more email, then before bed. As the hours passed, the weight of his own indecision grew heavier. Finally, the deadline arrived, and Ethan had done nothing. The next morning, he saw the announcement. The list of accepted candidates was posted, and his name was not on it, not because he wasn't qualified, not because he wasn't capable, but because he had never even tried. He felt a deep, sinking regret settle in his chest. The realization was brutal. He had lost before he had even stepped onto the battlefield. His overthinking had cost him something he couldn't get back. The worst part? This wasn't the first time. He could look back on so many moments in his life where he had hesitated too long, only to watch opportunities fade away. That evening, he sat alone, staring at his reflection in the window, lost in thought. He knew something had to change, but he didn't know how. His mind had always been this way, analyzing, questioning, doubting. How could he simply stop? The frustration, the disappointment in himself, it was overwhelming. He needed answers. He needed clarity. And so, the next morning, he made a decision. For once, without hesitation, he would visit the one person who had always guided him in the past, his old college professor. The man who had changed his perspective once before. Maybe, just maybe, he could help him see things differently once again. Ethan arrived at his former professor's office early in the morning, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his chest. He had always admired this man, not just for his intellect, but for his ability to see through complexity, to strip away the unnecessary noise and reveal the simple truths hidden beneath. If anyone could help him understand why he kept holding himself back, it was him. The professor welcomed him with a warm smile, gesturing for him to sit. Ethan hesitated, then finally spoke. "I can't seem to stop thinking, Professor. It's like my mind won't let me move forward. I analyze every decision, every possibility. And by the time I'm ready to act, the moment has already passed. It's ruining my life. I don't know what to do." The professor studied him for a moment, then nodded. As if he had been expecting this conversation, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Let me tell you a story." Ethan exhaled slowly, settling into his seat. He had always loved the way his professor taught, not through lectures or advice, but through stories that stayed with you long after they were told. Years ago, there was a soldier named Lucas. The professor began. Lucas had spent his entire life training to become a warrior. He was disciplined, skilled, and intelligent. But there was one flaw that held him back: he overthought everything. He analyzed his every move, calculated every possible risk, and second-guessed himself before every battle. His mind, sharp as it was, became his greatest enemy. One day, his kingdom was attacked, and Lucas was given a mission. He was to cross the river and lead his men into battle. It was a critical moment, victory depended on him acting swiftly. But as he approached the river, he saw a bridge stretching across the water, and instead of moving forward, he hesitated. What if the bridge isn't strong enough? What if it collapses while I'm crossing? What if the enemy is already on the other side, waiting to ambush us? His soldiers stood behind him, waiting for his command. But Lucas stood frozen, trapped in his own thoughts. Minutes turned into hours. The sun began to set, and while he stood there, lost in uncertainty, the enemy advanced. By the time he finally made the decision to move, it was too late. The battle was lost before it had even begun. The professor paused, allowing the weight of the story to settle between them. Ethan sat still, his hands clenched together, staring at the floor. He could feel the sting of recognition. He was no different from Lucas. He had spent years standing at the edge of his own bridge, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect certainty that would never come. The king was furious. The professor continued, not because Lucas had failed, but because he had never even tried. The king told him, the bridge was strong enough, but your doubts made it weak. Overthinking is worse than failure, because it stops you from even trying. Ethan swallowed hard. The words hit him with a clarity that left no room for argument. He had always been afraid of making the wrong decision. But in doing so, he had made the worst decision of all, to do nothing. He had let his own mind sabotage him. Not just once, but time and time again. He looked up at the professor, his voice quieter now. But how do I stop? It's not like I want to overthink. My mind just does it. The professor smiled knowingly. Reaching into his desk drawer, he pulled out a small, old coin and placed it on the table between them. Flip this, he said. Ethan frowned. Why? Because the moment it lands, you will have an answer. Heads or tails, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it forces you to choose. It bypasses the part of your brain that wants to overanalyze and gives you something concrete to act on. Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the coin. He realized, with a mix of amusement and frustration, that even now, he was overthinking whether or not to flip it. He let out a breath, then finally picked it up and tossed it into the air. It spun, caught the light, and landed. The professor leaned forward, looking him in the eye. You see, even with something as simple as this, your instinct was to hesitate. Now imagine how many times you've done this with real decisions in your life. Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the realization settle deep within him. He had always assumed that his overthinking was beyond his control, that it was just the way his mind worked. But what if it wasn't? What if it was simply a habit, a deeply ingrained one, but a habit nonetheless? And like any habit, it could be changed. The professor's voice softened. You have to train yourself to act. Ethan, the next time you catch yourself spiraling in doubt, give yourself a time limit. 30 seconds. 60 seconds. Then decide. The truth is, most of the time, the choice itself matters far less than the fact that you make one. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Ethan absorbed the words, feeling something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, change wasn't as impossible as he had always believed. Maybe the key wasn't to think less, but to trust himself more. Ethan walked out of his professor's office that day with a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He had come looking for a solution, expecting some complicated strategy to rewire his mind. But instead, he had left with something profoundly simple: a coin, a story, and the realization that his biggest enemy had never been failure. It had always been hesitation. The lesson echoed in his mind as he drove home. The bridge was strong enough, but your doubts made it weak. Overthinking is worse than failure because it stops you from even trying. He had spent years standing at the edge of his own bridges, waiting for certainty, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, the perfect version of himself. But what if certainty was an illusion? What if the only thing he had ever needed to do was step forward? That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the laptop screen in front of him. An email draft sat open. His application for the leadership program had long expired. But new opportunities would come. They always did. He had simply been too blinded by his own fears to see them. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. This time, he didn't allow himself to linger. He made a decision. He typed the email, reviewed it once, just once, and then, without overanalyzing, he hit send. A strange relief washed over him. The action itself was small, almost insignificant, but it felt like a rebellion against everything he had conditioned himself to believe. He had done something without second-guessing it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't calculated to the last detail, but it was done. He had moved. The next day, he made another choice. In a meeting at work, where he would normally stay silent, debating with himself whether his ideas were good enough to share, he spoke up. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't flawlessly articulated, but it was real, and for the first time, he realized that people weren't waiting to tear him apart. No one was scrutinizing his words the way he had always imagined. He had been his own harshest critic, his own biggest obstacle. As the weeks went by, Ethan continued making small but deliberate choices to act before his thoughts had the chance to hold him hostage. He gave himself time limits for decisions. He reminded himself that mistakes were not the enemy, stagnation was. He adopted a new rule: if something took less than 2 minutes to do, he would do it immediately. No overthinking. No hesitation. Slowly, something inside him began to shift. The fear didn't disappear entirely. He still felt it. Still heard the whispers of doubt, but he learned to move through it, rather than be paralyzed by it. One evening, months later, he sat in a coffee shop, working on a new project. His phone buzzed. A message from a colleague read, "Man, I don't know how you do it. You always seem so sure of yourself. Wish I had that kind of confidence." Ethan stared at the words for a moment, a quiet smile forming on his lips. If only they had known. If only they had seen the version of him from before, the one who had let hesitation rule his life, who had been terrified of taking a single step in the wrong direction. The truth was, he wasn't more certain now than he had been before. He had simply learned that certainty wasn't required. Action came first. Confidence followed. He thought back to the coin his professor had given him, still sitting on his desk at home. He hadn't needed to flip it in a long time. He had become his own decision maker. He had learned to trust himself. As he finished his coffee and packed up his things, he caught a glimpse of a young man sitting across the room. staring at his laptop with a familiar expression, hesitation, doubt, a mind spinning in endless circles. Ethan watched for a moment. Then, without thinking too much about it, he picked up a napkin, wrote a single sentence, and walked over. He placed it down in front of the man and walked away. The note read, "The bridge is strong enough. Just cross it." Ethan left the coffee shop that evening, stepping out into the cool night air, feeling something settle deep within him. The weight he had carried for so long, the constant pressure to make the perfect choice, the endless loops of hesitation, had lifted, replaced by something quieter but far more powerful. It wasn't the absence of fear, nor was it unshakable certainty. It was something simpler. Trust. For the first time in his life, he trusted himself. Not because he had suddenly found all the right answers, but because he had finally understood that there were no right answers. There was only action, only movement. And movement, no matter how uncertain, was always better than standing still. He walked slowly through the streets, past bright city lights and the steady hum of life moving around him. He thought about the younger version of himself, the one who had hesitated at every turn, who had let time slip through his fingers, who had stood at the edge of opportunities but never dared to step forward. He felt no anger toward that version of himself, only understanding. That younger Ethan had done the best he could with what he knew. But now, he knew better. When he arrived home, he sat at his desk, picking up the old coin his professor had given him months ago. He turned it between his fingers, feeling its weight, remembering the lesson it had carried. A tool to teach him how to decide, how to break the cycle of hesitation. He had relied on it once, but now, he no longer needed it. He placed it back down, not as a crutch, but as a reminder of how far he had come. The next morning, as he got ready for work, he glanced at his phone and saw a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of the napkin he had left on the table at the coffee shop. Below the words he had written, "The bridge is strong enough. Just cross it," was a simple reply. "Thank you. I needed this." Ethan smiled. It was a strange, quiet moment, but something about it felt full circle. He had once been the person sitting frozen in front of a screen, overthinking every move, paralyzed by the weight of decisions that had never even been made. Now, he was the one reminding someone else to take the first step. He didn't need to know if that stranger would change. He didn't need to see the outcome. That wasn't the point. The point was that the message had been passed forward. And somewhere, in another part of the city, someone else was holding that napkin, staring at those words, wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were true. Ethan put his phone down and picked up his bag. Then, without thinking too much about it, without waiting for the perfect moment, without analyzing every possibility, he stepped out the door, moving forward, the way he always should have.